With all of the things that are going on in the world right now around trade and tariffs, I wanted to take a couple of minutes to talk about what it actually takes for organizations, be it small or large, to navigate these uncertain times. In no way is this going to be a political statement, or am I going to share my political affiliations or beliefs. This is more intended to educate and share what it actually would take for companies to successfully navigate what's going on right now, because a lot of the stuff that's out there is grossly incorrect, or I would say not fully transparent. So today we're going to talk about that for a little bit. Let's get into it. Since the pandemic, the world has changed a lot, and I'm going to focus specifically on the economic and business side of it. I'm a little bit thankful for what happened during the pandemic in regards to the supply chain constraints and supply chain congestion specific in the US, along with other countries in the world, because that was probably the first time in my life or in my career, and I've been in this field for over 24 years, not to age myself, but that was the first time that in national radio or national news or even global news where the terms supply chain and logistics and trade were talked about more openly. I'm happy about it from that aspect, because not only did it get people questioning what it means and what that is, but it was also probably the best thing that's happened to the supply chain and logistics industry, because a lot of the people who were in college or getting into college got to experience these impacts and use it as an opportunity to say, hey, I'm not happy with how this got handled. I'm not happy with the complexity and not knowing what the nuances are to supply chain. It put more people into school with the intent of pursuing those degrees or those focused disciplines because they wanted to help change that dynamic or just to have a better understanding of it. So I'm happy about it from that aspect. Fast forward a couple of years later, and we have these conversations about tariffs and trade and what they're actually doing to the world. And again, I'm not going to talk about whether it's right and or wrong, but one of the things that don't get talked about ever, at least from what I've seen outside of in a boardroom or within corporate settings, is specifically to what it takes to avoid those tariffs. And there's two things that usually happen on this front. And the first one is the most common response that businesses take, and a lot of people believe that they can do this and simply exit, China as an example. We know a lot of tariffs are being placed on China. So the natural disposition would be to get product away from China, move it somewhere else so that we can import it and we can bypass these tariffs. Conceptually, yes, that is correct. But there's two things that work against that. One of the things that happens a lot right now, which most people are not familiar with, is companies in China are trying to keep the business that they have with countries like the US, Europe, and things like that. And what they will actually do is move manufacturing or move distribution into another country. The intent being that if it was made in China and you move it to a location like Vietnam, or you move it to another place in the Asia arena, that it would no longer be subject to tariffs. Depending how that's executed, that is not actually accurate. Most tariffs, specifically in the US or in a lot of other regions like in the EU, tariffs are actually assessed based on country of origin. Country of origin has a lot of different meanings behind it, but typically you can look at it in one of two ways. One, it's where was the product actually made? Not where was it purchased from, but where did it originate? How was it made? What raw materials were melted down to make steel? Where did that occur? If that happened in China and it was shipped to Vietnam, then it was sold from Vietnam to the US, that's still going to have a country of origin, more than likely of China, which wouldn't get around tariffs. So just moving those supply chains from A to B doesn't necessarily get you clear of what's happening right now. The other way that it would be looked at is financially. When you're making more of a semi-finished good or a finished good, as an example, a car would be a finished good. An engine would be a semi-finished good because it needs to go into something. Those usually get assessed by value. So if the value of the component or the part that's being purchased still has the majority of those dollars tied to a country of origin outside of where it's being exported from, it's still going to be liable to that country of origin tariff. So a lot of the stuff that we see in the news right now talks about being able to shift those supply chains from country A to country B. Because of what I just talked about, it's not as easy as it sounds to be able to do that. So that's the first part that we wanted to discuss. The second one that we want to discuss is, I'm not going to say it's complex because it is commonplace and it happens all the time. But changing vendors, changing your actual supply chain or your sources is not something that is done quickly. Small businesses will have a lot more flexibility and a lot more agility to do it because their manufacturing protocols, safety protocols, and things like that are not nearly as robust or governed by federal agencies or local agencies because they're small business and they're usually not making products that are going to warrant that type of scrutiny. When you get into the mid to large size organizations, that is a completely different animal. And a lot of the stuff, when you look at people who are making high tolerance technical components, or they're making automobiles or safety equipment or healthcare equipment, pharmaceutical supplies and things like that, the federal agencies and third-party regulators that look into those things have a very demanding and very strict schedule on how you get those vendors approved. So if someone wanted to move manufacturing airbags or seatbelts or pharmaceuticals from China to another country because they wanted to avoid what I just talked about on country of origin, but in addition, they wanted to be able to actually have true manufacturing in better regions that are more viable for trade, that process at best is going to be 12, 16, 18 months, depending on the sophistication of the supply chain and the amount of money that those organizations invest in it. The reason that that exists and the reason that it takes so long is when you're making airbags, again, as an example, you can't just find a new vendor, spin them up, have them make the same product and go into distribution. Every part of that supply chain needs to be vetted and approved not only by the purchaser of the goods, but by the regulatory agency or the agency that's ensuring standards. So if you're making a new manufacturing plant somewhere else in Southeast Asia, that plant has to get stood up. That plant has to get inspected by both internally and through external agencies to make sure it meets standards. Then they can go into production. Once they go into production, they have to produce limited amounts of goods. Those parts have to be shipped to the purchaser of the goods, and they have to go to third-party accreditors to where it's going to be absolutely scrutinized and go through very progressive, very rigorous testing to ensure that it meets the standards. After it passes those standards, they can go into limited production. And during those limited production runs, they're still going to have those levels of checks and balances. One, to make sure that they can produce a good that meets standard. And then secondarily, they have to do it again to make sure that they can produce goods in volume at scale with consistent output within a very small tolerance of specification. Once that is done, you can go into production and start bringing product into the US or wherever it may be. Even when that's done though, what a lot of people might not be aware of is those parts, since it's a new vendor and a new supplier, a new part that was recently just licensed or recently just approved for use on its application, the amount of audit and regulatory inspection that occurs on new parts from new supply chains is excessive. It's not a malicious activity. It's because these parts and these goods need to ensure that they will not cause harm to their consumers or the end users. So moving a supply chain from one location to another is not going to be something that is a very time-friendly issue. The reason that that's important, because a lot of the stuff that we see in the news right now, even though the tariffs are happening, we haven't heard a lot about companies moving product from country A to country B. There have been stories about it, don't get me wrong, but it's not happening at scale because the expense and time that goes into that is very, very expensive, and it is a very, very long lead time. So what a lot of organizations are doing right now is they're waiting. They are eating the higher tariffs, or they are passing those expenses back on to the consumers like you and me. They believe that this is a temperamental or a temporary issue that could be changed or could be alleviated if administration changes. Because of how long it takes, and let's just say you're one of the more modest companies and it's an 18-month roadmap, you're talking about 2 years to get that product up and running, and then how many years after that of additional scrutiny from regulatory agencies and auditing bodies to make sure that that part is consistently good before they ease up a little bit. There's always going to be audit, there's always going to be inspection, but it does lessen as you build a history of success. So the MO right now for a lot of organizations is, unfortunately, wait and see. They don't want to make these large investments and make these big supply chain shifts because it is very disruptive and it can come with a lot of increased risk as well as expense. They want to wait and see because in 4 years, there could be a new administration that comes up with different policies and unpacks all this stuff. They will wait for the administration to change because that's a 4-year process. We're already, well into the first year. If they start making those changes now, you're talking about 18 months from now, and you're getting close to the end of the administration. So they wait and they see because there is a probability that the next administration unpacks a lot of these changes. And then when you would look at it, this organization could come back and say, in the 30 years of my history, we had 2 or 3 years of a blip because of, evolving trade policy. But other than that, it was a one-time thing and we went back to normal. So moving supply chains is not an easy fix. Lower grade components, again, you're seeing that stuff already. They're moving already. But to be able to shift that kind of stuff, if you're making anything that goes into a human body, it goes into a product that has safety requirements, even things like clothing and textiles, those all go on people's skin and people wear it, and they won't go through the same level of rigorous testing. But there is an expectation that the things that you sell will not do harm and they have to get approved. I wanted to share that because it's not talked about a lot. And a lot of people have become familiar with supply chain and logistics because of what the pandemic has done, which is, again, from a supply chain education and awareness standpoint, I think is absolutely awesome that more people are aware of and now sensitive to what this could mean for them, their wallet, and their quality of life or their lifestyle. But knowing what it takes to actually shift these is something that I think people need to understand because they're looking for tariffs have been applied to these countries, so just shift and get out of them. And it's a very quick win. It's a very easy thing to adjust. And unfortunately, that's just not how these things play out. In fact, some of these things, even if it's not a change in country, going back to the airbag example, because it is considered a safety component, a lot of things in automotive or in technology nowadays are considered safety components, which go through very rigorous testing. Those alone, if you keep the same vendor and they're setting up a new manufacturing plant, you go through an entirely new authentication and approval process. Because again, it's new people, it's new facilities, it's new equipment being set up for the first time, going to mass production. Even if it's a direct clone, in the eyes of the regulatory agencies, the government, or even the purchasers of the goods, they look at it as net new, which means that investment in that rigorous examination happens again. That's the same vendor making the same component at a different plant. They're still going to go through that process. Changing vendors and keeping them in the same country goes through the same process. So you can imagine if you go through that process to stay with the same vendor making the same good, and they go through that, going to a different vendor or the same vendor in a foreign country is going to be exponentially more difficult. It happens all the day. Companies are very proficient at it, but it is a costly endeavor, and usually it's a part of a longer term strategy. Right now, for companies to have to do that, just because of what's happening today, they look at that as a reactionary measure, not a proactive approach. That's just not worth the investment unless they know that what's happening in the global economy today is here to stay. I wanted to share that with all of you because it is something that needs to be talked about more, because when we look at the news and we see what's going on, there is only a very small, very frosted level of transparency on what actually takes to move these things. So now that we're getting into those conversations and it's obviously front and center in the news for the things that we're consuming today, those of you that watch this will at least be able to have a little bit more of an understanding on why there is so much nuance and why we're not seeing the shifts that we would expect to see quickly based on what has happened from administration and recent updates into trade policy. That being said, we are seeing those shifts. Those shifts have started prior to trade policy. We are all aware that countries like the US have a great dependency on foreign countries for trade, when some of that stuff definitely could be produced within our own borders. But there's a lot that goes into that, like I just said. But when you look at these things that are out there, when you look at building materials, when you look at sheet goods, when you look at sheet goods being like steels and stuff like that, when you look at any electronic or even microchips or processors, over 70 to 80% of all of those categories that I just mentioned are China or Taiwan centric, meaning that if those countries went offline, there would be absolute disruption and chaos to the global economy because the vast majority of those parts are coming from those locations. Because of that, companies have started to look at investing in new regions to create risk mitigation. All organizations are very big on risk mitigation. No organization wants to have all of their spend and all of their supply chain tied to a single vendor or a single country, because if anything like what's going on right now with trade were to occur, it creates absolute disruption. So companies have already started to reinvest in their supply chains to create that diversification so they don't have such dependency around the world. Because of that, the wheels didn't fall off the bus when these tariffs got announced over the last several of months. What's happening because of what's going on right now, we're seeing that get expedited a little bit more into a longer term strategy where organizations maybe limit 40% of their acquired goods coming from low cost countries like China and going into maybe a more mediary location. We're seeing a lot of shift right now going into the Southeast Asia market like Vietnam or Thailand, Malaysia, things like that. We're seeing even more go to India. We're seeing a lot, especially on the automotive side, going into Mexico. So organizations are going down those paths right now, but they are doing that with the intent of risk mitigation, not as a byproduct or a reactionary measure against new trade policies. All that being said, the message that I want to leave this audience with is that changing supply chains, changing vendors for large and medium-sized companies is not a task that can just be executed in a very quick fashion. If there is anything that's going on your body, in your body, or has anything to do with safety, which is a lot of the things that we consume, beverages, clothing, medication, car parts, services, oils, sheet goods, building materials, a lot of that stuff all has to go through that scrutiny. You don't want to worry about the wood that was imported from another country not meeting the engineering specifications to build your house. And I know that sounds a little bit weird, but that is the truth. A lot of the things that we use go through scrutiny from these regulatory agencies or third-party bodies to ensure that they meet a standard to promote safety and sustainability in use. That's what I wanted to share with you. If you guys have questions, I'd love to hear about it. Please put it in the comments section below. We're going to talk about a lot more of these things in regards to business and economics, because obviously that is the core of my background. I'd love to hear from you and talk about more things that are intriguing to you or that you're hearing in the news that you'd like to have a little bit more depth on from someone who has lived that life for over 2 decades at an executive and a professional level and has advanced education in both of those industries. As always, I appreciate you guys, and we'll talk soon. Later.
I've been trying to call. I've been on my own for long enough. Maybe you can show me how to love.